his bunker. But World War II rages on across Europe. Here in Czechoslovakia and in Prague, the people are still being held captive by their Nazi occupiers. Now, the Allied forces are approaching from the west, slowly liberating cities as they go, but they're several days away from Prague. The Soviet 2 million man Red Army is approaching from the east, also liberating cities as they go, and also several days away from Prague. The people here in Prague are stuck waiting for their liberation. But they decide they're not going to wait. They want to take matters into their own hands. They start planning an armed resistance against the Nazi occupation. Well, on the night of April 30th, 1945, Karl Hermann Frank, the leader of the German army here in Prague, hears about this resistance and gets on the radio to announce to the entire country that any resistance will be drowned in a sea of blood. He's not kidding around, because the next day, the Czechs come out into the streets, this time peacefully protesting against the Nazi occupation. Well, Karl Hermann Frank immediately orders the German army after them, and their instructions are to disperse the crowds, send the Czechs home, and any Czechoslovak civilian who refuses to leave the streets should be shot immediately. Now, this is really effective at pushing the resistance underground, but it fails to stop them. They continue to communicate in secret for several more days and make plans, until the morning of May 5th, 1945, when an announcement goes out on the Czech radio at 6 a.m., just like every morning. The announcement is, the hour is 6, just like every day. But on this day, May 5th, instead of the Czech word for 6, which is šest, they use the German word, which is sechs. And this was to be the key word to start the rebellion. And tens of thousands of Czechoslovak civilians rise up from their homes, armed and ready to battle the Nazis in the streets. Now, these civilians, when I say armed, I mean they're carrying whatever weapons they can find. So maybe an old rifle passed down through the family as an heirloom, or a couple of knives they took from their kitchen, or one guy had an old box of grenades left over from World War I. This is all they had to fight with. But they were ready to battle the Nazis, and they started fighting them in the streets. Now, pretty quickly, Karl Hermann Frank figures out where the resistance is based, so he sends 90 SS troops, armed to the teeth, to the radio building to try to take it over. But the resistance is ready for them. They start fighting back, and a battle breaks out for control of the radio building. Bullets are flying from inside to outside, outside to inside. In the hallways of the radio building, close quarters combat. Now, people listening to the radio all over the country, they can hear the battle, the firefight going on in the background. So these Czech civilians, they flood to the radio building, they break in through the roof, and they start fighting the Nazis, pushing them down, slowly, room by room, floor by floor, until after 18 hours of non-stop fighting, the Nazis are trapped in the basement, where they would eventually surrender. Meanwhile, the rest of the Czech resistance is taking over the rest of the city, and they're surprisingly successful at it. They managed to capture more than half of Prague. They erect over 1,000 barricades in the streets in the style of the French Revolution. And at this point, the mayor of Prague declares his allegiance to the Czech resistance. And on May 5th, it seems like the battle's going to be won, because on the night of May 5th, the German troops are stuck in their last remaining stronghold, the German barracks, which they would also surrender. So on May 5th, it seemed like the Czechs had won this fight. But then May 5th became May 6th. And overnight, the German armies that were based in towns and cities all around Prague had flooded into the city. And in the morning of May 6th, the reinforcements arrived for the Germans. They continue to battle, and they start fighting back against the Czechs, and this time the tides start to turn in the wrong direction. Now, at the same time, the Allied forces have arrived in the city of Plzeň, only 55 miles west of Prague, just a few hours away by tank. The Soviet 2 million man Red Army is still several days away. So the battle continues to rage on in the streets here in Prague. The Nazis try to take the radio building again, and again they're pushed away. So this time, they send in the Luftwaffe to start bombing the city. And this is when the Old Town Hall back in Old Town Square gets destroyed. The radio building also gets destroyed, and the Czechs have to move to another underground location to continue broadcasting. The battle rages on in the streets. As May 6th becomes May 7th, people are dying on both sides, the bombs are falling on the city. And on the morning of May 7th, the Czechs hear that the Allies have arrived in Plzeň, just a few hours away from here. So they get on the radio to announce to the Allied forces, in English, they announce, Allied forces, come to Prague, help the Czech resistance, because with your help, we can fight off the Nazis once and for all. But the Allied forces in Plzeň, they hear the message, and they understand it. They refuse to come. Because before the war, the Allies and the Soviets had made a deal on a demarcation line through the center of Europe. The Allies were to liberate all cities west of this line. The Soviets were to liberate all cities east of it. But unfortunately for the people of Prague, this line fell directly between Prague and Plzeň. The Allied forces would not break this arbitrary arrangement and refused to go any further. So the Czechs were stuck fighting on their own against the Nazis here. And on May 7th, it seemed like the battle was going in the wrong direction. And it felt like all hope was lost, because the Czechs were running out of ammunition and healthy men to fight with. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, at this crucial moment, something miraculous happened that would change the course of history forever. Now, it gets a bit complicated, so see if you can follow this. There was a group of Soviet soldiers already here in Prague. But they weren't fighting for the Soviets, they were fighting for the Nazis. They were traitors to the Soviet Union, here in Prague fighting against the Czech resistance. They weren't fighting for the Nazis because they believed in Hitler, they were fighting for the Nazis because they didn't believe in communism. So they had turned on the Soviet Union, and they were fighting on the sides of the Nazis in World War II. They were called the Anti-Communist Liberation Army. Well, these Soviet traitors here in Prague started to realize that when the Soviet army gets here in a couple of days, they're screwed. Because the Soviets would not treat them very lightly. They would be taken away to gulags in Siberia where they would spend the rest of their lives being tortured. They realized their only chance to survive was to get out of Prague and make it to the Allied lines in Plzeň, where they could surrender to the Allies and beg for mercy. So the Anti-Communist Liberation Army turns on their former Nazi allies, becoming traitors for the second time. And they start firing from the front, the sides, behind. All hell breaks loose. The Nazis don't know who's on their side anymore. And eventually, they're successful. They make it out of Prague and all the way to Plzeň, where they surrender to the Allies. Now, a week later, the Allies would turn them over to the Soviets anyway. And they did spend the rest of their lives being tortured in gulags in Siberia. But the important thing is that on the way out of Prague, they left behind boxes of weapons and ammunition for the Czech resistance, which they could then use to continue the fight against the Nazis, because they didn't have this ammunition before. So this gave the Czechs a new lease on life. They continue to fight against the Nazis. And now, neither side, the fight starts going in the other direction, but eventually, neither side is making any progress. People on both sides are being killed in the streets, and the bombs are still falling on the city. But then both sides come to a realization. The Germans realize that the Soviet army is going to be here any day now. And if they get here, these exhausted and depleted German troops will have no chance against this much, much stronger Russian force, battle-ready army. At the same time, the Czech resistance realizes that, yeah, they can probably hold off the Nazis a couple more days until the Soviets get here, but if they try, because of the bombs falling on the city, their entire capital city of Prague will be demolished. So they call a ceasefire. Both sides come to the negotiating table. The Germans ask for safe passage out of Prague, and in return, they promise not to damage anything on the way out. The Czech resistance accepts the terms of this agreement, and before any Soviet troops arrive here in Prague, the entire Nazi army hightails it out of here. In other words, 30,000 untrained and ill-equipped Czechoslovak civilians, using only stolen and improvised weapons, managed to fight off and defeat 900,000 highly trained, well-equipped Nazi soldiers to liberate themselves from the shackles of the Third Reich. And that's the story that's so rarely told, because only a few days later, the Soviet army would come into Prague and claim all of the credit for liberating this city. Now, the Czechs would have a few years of democracy and freedom until 1948, when they would find themselves in the wrong half of Europe, the eastern half, and fall victim to the Iron Curtain. And it would be another 41 years of oppression before the desire for freedom that flows through the blood of all Czech people would finally be fulfilled in the Velvet Revolution of 1989. And now today, 20 years after that revolution, the Czechs can finally call this city, Prague, the capital, their own free country. That's the end of my story and the end of my tour, so thank you very much.
Yay! Woo!
Thanks. It's all like muffled clapping.